Good morning, community. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me for another Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, and today we're having a real conversation with Dr. Don Chick, president and founder of New Synergist Consulting. He's a subject matter expert in change management and leadership development, and he and I have partnered together on several projects. Dr. Chick, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you, Dr. Anita. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you. Typically, I kind of, sort of, for the most part, know where it is I'm going to go with the conversation. But today, I'm putting myself in the learner's seat, just like a lot of our audience today. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you. I know that you and I, when we work with clients, we are very much focused on integrating diversity, inclusion, and belonging with leadership. I think, and we've had this discussion that a lot of companies are still wanting to keep diversity inclusion in a separate container away from the rest of the business. And that's how we have both decided we don't do check the box initiatives where it's like, okay, we've done this for, 1 to 3 years, then we're done. We see it as change of culture behaviors, which requires integration of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and leadership. How did you come to that determination as a consultant?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for everyone to understand that if diversity, equity, inclusion is important, it ought to be an integral part of what you do every day in your organization. It's
Mhm.
not something we do, okay, we have some bandwidth or some extra time, so let's work on this initiative. It should be a way of life.
Mhm.
And when folks look at the leadership of their organization, they're really looking to see what you really want, not just what you say, but what you do. So if you're not talking about DNI, if you're not walking the talk, then people will see that and they'll understand, well, it's not as important as making money.
Mhm.
Now, some people will say, well, if you're a private sector organization, your responsibility to stay alive in some ways is to make money. Absolutely. So what I like to talk about with organizations when we talk DNI is the fact that we're going to talk about how to utilize DNI to make more money,
Hmm.
not not just because it's important or the right thing, which it is, but it's a way of actually improving your business so you can make money or more money.
And that's how you capture the attention of the CEOs and other business leaders in the company to start to make this a priority because you immediately tie it to the bottom line, right?
Exactly. It's not something that's, as you mentioned earlier, an extra duty or something nice to do. It
Mhm.
should be an integral part of the way you run your business. And in most cases, even though some leaders don't recognize it, it is actually a part of your system, a part of your goals, a part of your infrastructure that actually can make your company run better.
So, based on what you said, two questions come to mind. The first is, in my work, I focus on helping people raise their awareness about belonging and the fact that you can have diversity, you can have inclusion, you can have equity, but that does not necessarily mean that you have belonging. So that's where I focus on my business. And I especially work with executives and mastermind groups and their middle managers to make that really clear so that we understand what belonging is, that then enables them to increase those profits that obviously hit the bottom line. How do you frame equity in your conversations?
Well, one of the things about diversity, equity, inclusion, they all tie together. So you might have one of those or do well at one of those. Hey, we do we do a great job at recruiting. Look at our company. We're very diverse. You might hear that from some, and they may be accurate. But if you don't create a system where people feel included, then they tend to leave.
Mhm.
If they don't feel things are equitable, then they feel less motivated,
Mhm.
less engaged. And engagement is tied to your culture and it's tied to innovation. If I'm not engaged, okay, I'll check the blocks, I'll come to work, I'll do, I guess, what I'm supposed to do, but doing extra or working just a little harder, maybe not so much.
When you talk about working extra and a little bit harder, earlier you mentioned the fact that it needs to become a way of life. But as you and I both know, oftentimes these efforts are usually given to people of color. It's extra work, it's extra effort, and no extra money. So let's talk about that because I'm working with a client who's actually considering that if someone is part of an ERG, an employee resource group, that they would get a small stipend in recognition of that extra work that has to be done on top of their regular jobs. So tell us in those terms the importance of integrating diversity, inclusion, and belonging efforts with leadership so that it's not always on the shoulders of people of color who are really going the extra mile, knocking themselves out, and not necessarily getting any kind of financial benefit from it. Not that that's the point, but it's in recognition of their efforts. Just like any other person working on a business strategy might receive a bonus at the end of the year for having done good work.
Well, you've, I think, actually highlighted how important it is. If I work for a company and I'm working on a project that does really well, for instance, I just knock the socks off, and people say, wow, he did a great job. I am very likely to get some type of bonus,
Mhm,
certainly recognition, a promotion or
mhm,
promotions. So why wouldn't that happen if I was doing the same type of work or making the same type of impact in
mhm,
terms of our diversity and inclusion efforts? So again, it ties back to how are we treating diversity and inclusion as compared to other aspects of the workplace?
mhm,
And also, as you mentioned, this ties, how I think leadership, culture, and innovation are tied together. So, what am I doing about the culture of the organization?
mhm,
That's a critical part of what leaders should be doing, regardless of whether we're talking diversity and inclusion or something else.
mhm,
It's a leadership imperative. Are you managing the culture of your organization? Are you as innovative as you should be or want to be? And then, as a leader, what are you doing about that?
mhm. I think that what you just said and the way you just explained it pushes me a little bit more to the side that says, yeah, I do think that that's fair to offer a bonus to those who are supporting ERG when they can prove how it has impacted the bottom line. Again,
Correct.
what we don't want is the common, oh, that's reverse discrimination. Oh, they're getting paid to, do fluff work. That is absolutely not the case. And to your point, anytime the business measurement has been attained or over exceeded, a bonus is given. And if we're seeing diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging as business imperatives that will positively impact the bottom line, then why shouldn't we give people a bonus for having made that happen, just like any other strategic plan? Now, how do you think that kind of reasoning is going to fly with most leaders today? What do you think?
Well, it's something that needs work. And
Hmm.
part of you mentioned early awareness, and one of my personal favorite classes that we teach is just simply self awareness for leaders,
Hmm.
and we want them to be aware of the impact they're making. They're
Hmm.
making an impact. All of us, to some extent, are making an impact around the people that we work with or work for. But what is that? And why is that impact being made?
Mhm,
So, even beyond the ERGs and other teams like that, when you think of your leadership team, is there a benefit to them, an obvious benefit of making sure their part of the organization is more diverse, for instance, more inclusive? Or if they do a great job of that, no, not necessarily any benefit to them.
mhm,
And the benefits are more than just money as well.
mhm,
What type of words are we using? How are we sharing our happiness or awareness that this person is really a DNI champion, for instance, maybe as compared to his or her peers?
Mhm. When you talk about integrating, as you and I do in our work together, when you talk about integrating leadership and diversity, inclusion, belonging, I recall a session that I facilitated this past July, and there had been a little bit of chatter that I became aware of before we got started. So I decided, all right, we're going to change the way we're going to start this. And I gave people about 30 minutes in their areas, in their tables, to just talk about the stories that they had been telling themselves about what the next 2 days were going to be like, and let them kind of get that out of their system. And halfway into the morning after that discussion, I had asked some type of question. I was taking them through another exercise, and someone said, this is not what I expected. This is leadership. And I said, absolutely. It's all leadership. However, it makes you more aware of how the diversity on your team shows up in terms of their experiences, either professional or personal experiences, that shape the way they approach a problem, that shape the way they problem solve, that shape the way they collaborate. So, back to the work that you and I do, really focusing on integrating diversity, inclusion, and belonging with leadership. What are some of your key goals when you're working with a client?
Well, one of those goals, as I've talked about my interest and experience in change management,
Mhm,
and I actually look at DIB initiatives as a change management initiative.
mhm,
So when you're trying to, first of all, when we look at change management, we know there's going to be resistance.
mhm,
If you want to make an enemy, try to change something.
mhm,
And whether it's a DIB initiative or something else, I know there will be resistance, even when we're making things better, whatever you want to consider better.
mhm,
So we focus on the chatter. We want to encourage the chatter. We don't want to put people down if they criticize the effort or ask questions like, why are we doing this? Because I would rather, as a leader, I would rather have that out in the open
mhm,
so we can address it versus it's there, but everybody's afraid to say it.
mhm,
Nobody wants to be the person to say, I think this DIB initiative is a waste of time.
mhm.
I actually, if that's in their minds, I actually hope we hear that out loud. Then we can address it. And we want to address it not by saying you're wrong or you're bad or how could you think that?
Mhm.
We want to simply have a discussion about that. So then we can share why this effort is going to make our organization better and stronger.
So I want to unpack a few things you said there, talking about getting it out on the table. There are two things that I have been accustomed to saying lately. The first is, do I want to be right or do I want to be received? So you mentioned the fact that anytime you want to change something, the antibodies are automatically going to go up, even if you know it's for the better because you're changing my world. Stop. I don't want to go there with you. So I really focus on my message, although based in my experience and my research and my education, although my message is right, I focus on being received because if the message is received, then I don't have to announce or proclaim that I'm right. You will figure that out. And when I say right, I don't mean to say I've got all the answers. I mean to say that when my message is properly positioned and is received well, people will see the merits of what I'm saying, right? So that's the first
Exactly.
thing that I want to unpack. The second thing that I want to unpack is now let's talk about change management, culture change, and innovation. When I'm working with my clients, I tell them that if I can get you to raise your awareness by 1% every day, that's change. And over time, that's amazing change. And sometimes the little changes over time means so much more than a big change that people are fighting and struggling with. And what always comes to mind are the things that we all have in our household or in the office, sticky notes. These
Mm,
little things revolutionize the world, and they were not intended to do that. They were intended for something else. But once it was reframed at 3M, hey, maybe we've got something here. Seriously, it's revolutionized the workplace and home. So when we're talking about small changes revolutionizing things, when we're talking about innovation, when we're talking about just a 1% increase in awareness every day, how does that play into the work that you do specific to innovation and change in terms of change management?
Well, part of a leader's duties are to empower folks in their organization to make changes, make adjustments as things change. One of the things that I like to share with people is the fact that, let's say your organization is being run perfectly today. I mean, literally, everything is exactly the way it should be. Well, tomorrow, if you don't make adjustments, you've slipped a little bit because the external environment is changing and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't stop it, but you're operating in that environment.
Mhm.
So you need to make adjustments. So really, that's what innovation is. Now, most of what folks think about innovation is, some big invention that somebody did. Most innovation is incremental.
Mhm.
So we've got transformational innovation, and then we've just got that regular everyday adjustment that people are making. So to your point earlier about raising someone's awareness, even by only 1%, might allow them to make a 1% adjustment in terms of DIB, for instance. And that 1% can become 5%, can become 10%. And we get back to our discussion on impact. Now that person is making an impact, and people are saying, wow, if he can do it, or if he is doing it, maybe I should be doing that as well.
Mhm.
And then it spreads like a virus. So we want this good virus to be spread throughout our organization.
A good virus, absolutely a good virus, because we want this thing that's going on right now to hurry up and get out of here so that we can
Yes.
be back with our clients, right? It's been so the virtual sessions have been effective, but there's nothing like being in a room with people. And
Absolutely.
this month's theme is taking the scariness out of inclusion, belonging discussions. And when I think about for so long when we were required to wear masks, in some places we have the freedom not to, but in some places it's still a requirement, and in some places, that's a whole nother discussion.
Yes.
But when you think about the fact that, I have to wear a mask, all you can see is my eye. You cannot see the expression on my face, unless I raise my eyebrows or wink at you. You don't really know what's going on in here. And
Mhm.
so when we talk about removing the scariness from these conversations, I think part of the scariness is asking people, to your point about slowly but surely getting people adjusted to a new way of thinking that perhaps and hopefully will lead to a new way of being. Part of the scary thing is looking at how we need to change some things about the biases that we hold. And we've heard that if you have a brain, you have bias. Everyone has bias. But I try to get people to understand is it's not to say I don't have them or to eliminate them, is to be aware of them and better manage them. And in some cases, better managing them is to say, this bias doesn't serve me. I need to let that go. And in some cases, it's saying, oh, I didn't recognize that I had a bias. Let me work on that. So, in terms of taking the scariness out of innovation and culture, what would you recommend for our audience, whether they're the CEO or whether they're boots on the ground, whether they're part of an ERG or whether they're just now really getting into this whole notion of diversity, inclusion, and belonging?
Well, a big part of the scariness is something we like to call psychological safety.
Yes.
If I don't understand why we're doing this, the scariness around being seen as uh, not aware
Mhm.
or not a good person,
Mhm.
because maybe there's, you know, it sounds like maybe I'm a racist or I don't
Mhm.
like certain types of people.
Mhm.
So we want to take the scariness out. So questions are okay.
Mhm,
So a lack of understanding
mhm.
is okay because we're here to learn from everyone.
I want to interrupt you for a second. Can we camp out at I don't want people to think I'm not a good person? Let's just hang out
Mhm.
here for a minute there.
Okay.
It's where does that come from? And on the one hand, I get it, but on the other hand, it's an opportunity, which is why when I'm facilitating, I always tell people this is not about shame and blame. It's about know and grow. And
Mhm.
as an adolescent up to maybe high school, if you weren't around diverse people, that's not your fault. That's the way you were brought up. That's the way you're raised. That's where your parents, chose to live, what have you. That's not your fault. However, once you become an adult, it is incumbent upon you to take the initiative to understand how the world and the people in the world really show up. And so, again, it goes back to getting rid of the shame and blame and knowing and growing. Would that help someone to get over this I'm a bad person thing?
I think it will. Certainly, that's something we want to do in these types of environments. But
Mhm.
we also want to make sure um, everyone is addressing everyone as an individual person and they're respecting the fact that maybe they don't agree with everything, maybe
Mhm.
they don't understand everything, but we can learn from each other.
Mhm.
So, one of the things I like to do in these workshops is let's start with some ground rules. And one of those ground rules is we're going to first seek to understand
Yes.
without judgment.
Yes.
And even things like I've called people on, we sit in a meeting, somebody says something or asks a question, and you get some eye rolls. They don't say anything because we've already set the ground rules. And I'll even say, not trying to shame you, but let's talk about how you feel right now. And sometimes I'll even say, because I notice an eye roll or whatever.
Mhm. Mhm.
Again, not saying it's bad, but I want to understand how you are feeling, how we're all feeling.
Mhm.
And it's not unreasonable for someone to say, I feel uncomfortable. I feel like I'm being picked on. I
Mhm.
feel like I might be part of a group that's being singled out, et cetera, et
Mhm.
cetera. We want to address those feelings
Now,
because
as a facilitator, I don't mean to interrupt you, but as a facilitator, do you ever, not scary, but do you ever feel hesitant in a situation like that where somebody says, I feel like I'm being picked on because you're the one facilitating the discussion? So, how's that for you?
well, you get used to it. So
Mhm.
I also have to set aside my judgments and
Yes.
be willing to be vulnerable and
Yes.
open.
Yes.
So instead of maybe feeling like, hey, now you're trying to pick on me or
Right.
challenge me as the facilitator,
Right.
I'll simply start with an open ended question like, why do you feel that way?
Yeah.
I might even ask, depending on how the conversation is going, what can I do to make you not feel that way or
Yeah.
feel less
Mhm.
attacked
Mhm.
or criticized?
Mhm.
Because that's not what I'm trying to do.
I think that sometimes the role that we fulfill as a facilitator, people might think that we have all the answers, we're the sage on stage, we're the authority in the room. And actually, if we're going to have a real conversation, which is what this is, sometimes as a facilitator, I'm hesitant to say or do what I know needs to be said or done because of the reaction that might happen. Do you ever feel that way?
Well, yes. And I try to make sure that while I may still need to ask the question,
Mhm.
I'm constantly asking myself, will my next statement move us forward,
Yes.
backward?
Yes. How
And
could
of
this go
course,
sideways? We have to
yes.
think about that.
So I don't want it to go sideways.
Right.
And part of that is starting off the session
Mhm.
with a set of values. We want to understand, we don't want to criticize anybody.
Mhm.
This is not a forum where we're going to say, well, everybody that looks like is bad or everybody that looks like is good.
Mhm,
That's not the case.
mhm,
So how do we address our feelings even without necessarily agreeing with each other?
mhm.
We want the feelings out there, then we can start hopefully to making adjustments that'll help us all uh, be more whole persons and have a better understanding of each other.
Years ago when I first started in this work, which I absolutely love, because you never know how it's going to go, even though you've got the experience behind you that says, if I, it's kind of like chess, if I move here and they move here, or if I move here and they move here. So you're always having to anticipate. But years ago when I first started, what I found scary, Dr. Chick, was silence. If I would ask a question and nobody would say anything, I'd
Hmm.
automatically think, okay, I just asked the wrong thing, or I've just made everyone in the room uncomfortable, or I've made some people angry. And sometimes silence, well, most of the time, silence is people are processing what you've said. So tell us about the scariness of silence, either in the room when someone happens to mention, hey, we had set the rules, but there's an eye roll here, or on a one on one basis where someone commits a subtle act of exclusion, either in what they've said or what they've done. And instead of calling people out, we're trying to call people in. How do individuals manage that scary silence that exists when people are thinking about what's just happened and how to overcome it?
Well, silence, as I mentioned earlier, in a different light, is something we want to avoid because,
Mm,
like you mentioned, people are having feelings, thoughts about the discussion, and silence doesn't allow us to address their feelings because they're not sharing them.
mm,
So, depending on the venue and who's there, I'm in many cases, I started off with saying, in some cases, I'm going to call on you
mm,
and I'm going to ask you a question.
mhm,
I want you to know up front, and I'm telling the whole group that I'm not picking on you. I'm not trying to embarrass you, but to make this session more beneficial, we need to hear everyone's thoughts.
right.
So, part of my role as a facilitator is to make sure everybody gets a chance to share their feelings.
Mm,
Now, part of the reason I do that from experience, and in all types of scenarios, whether it's DIB or something else, everybody has a different style.
mhm.
Everybody has a different personality. Some people are less willing to share for various reasons than others. And you don't want one person or one set of ideas to dominate your session. You want to hear from everybody.
So let's go back to innovation and change. I think we've pretty well talked about integrating leadership and diversity, inclusion, belonging up to this point. Now I want to go back to innovation and change because I know change management and leadership development are the focus areas of your business. And I think those being your focus areas and what I bring to the table is just one of many reasons that our partnership is so effective and so
Mhm.
enjoyable for the two of us and how we're able to impact the organizations that we work with. So tell us how you position innovation and change. And in particular, I'm thinking about innovation in terms of artificial intelligence. I was just reading an article about Amazon, even though it's not a white collar work setting that we're talking about, out on the assembly line, in the where they're packaging things, the shipping. There's so many opportunities that they're taking advantage of to automate things. And in the article, it talked about the fact that people in the same warehouse don't even know each other's names because they're spaced so far apart and they're working so much more with automation than they are with people. So, again, referring back to this month's theme of taking the scariness out of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and your expertise in innovation and change, talk to us about artificial intelligence because on the one hand, me personally, I see the benefits to it, but on the other hand, I'm very, very concerned. What's going to happen to the people? Where are people going?
Well, this ought to be a concern, excuse me, for all of us. I think AI is a great thing. I'm
Mhm.
an engineer by background, so that's one of those things that sounds exciting to me. But one of the things we already know is AI can and likely will change the way we interact with each other.
Mhm.
And even when you think of what's gone on over the last 18 months in terms of the pandemic, it's forced us to do a lot of virtual interaction with each other.
Mhm.
Well, even though it's close, it's still different from being in a face to face situation. And some people really like virtual interactions. Some people just deal with it because they have to, and others absolutely hate it. So, one of the things about AI that we need to be aware of is not to be afraid of it, not to keep moving forward because it's going to move forward whether we like it or not.
Mhm.
But how do we maintain the human interactions
Mhm.
that we need to be team oriented, to be able to work together, so we don't lose that teamwork atmosphere that we have when we're face to face.
Mm.
So, an interesting thing about AI, when you just one example, IBM maybe 15 years ago really embraced the virtual world.
Was
And
that when they introduced Watson? IBM is Watson, right?
not just because of Watson,
Okay.
they were looking at things like, look how much money we can save on real estate
Mm.
if everybody works from their home or most
Oh,
people.
okay. All right.
So, and they I think I read a number worldwide, it was something like $55 billion in
Oh.
savings, utility costs, real estate costs, et cetera, et cetera.
And just
Now,
before you go on, for our audience who may not be familiar with Watson, can you give us a little bit of description about Watson?
well, Watson is an AI tool that has been developed by IBM,
Mhm.
and well, AI is about really true AI is about utilizing software that actually can learn.
Right.
So one of the big things that made Watson more famous a few years ago, Watson actually beat a chess master
Yes.
because that chess program, I'll call it that for simplicity, was able to learn how to play chess better,
Mhm.
learn better how to anticipate problems.
Mhm.
And the AI is getting really, really good at that, certainly improving.
Mhm. Mhm. You know
Um,
what, Dr. Chick, I want to take this to a different direction because I'm thinking about it. When we're talking about AI and diversity, inclusion, belonging, I was also recently reading about the fact that when it comes to facial recognition, and I know that's big in companies right now, they are not able to distinguish anything other than a Caucasian face. So, can you talk about that in terms of how AI will affect diversity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives and efforts?
well, that is a very interesting question. And one of the problems they've had is not necessarily with AI not being able to recognize a dark face as well as a light face, but actually because of potentially because of unconscious bias.
Mhm.
They didn't use enough test subjects
Mhm.
that were darker. And because of that, the AI was making more mistakes when it
Mhm.
came to identifying those of us in the darker persuasion.
Mhm.
So again, when I talk about decision making, for instance, we have to be aware of our biases. And you
Mhm.
mentioned this earlier because it's not necessarily this problem is not necessarily caused by the AI platform per se, but it's caused by bias,
Yeah.
which focus more on Caucasian subjects. So
Yes.
the database, whole lot of Caucasian subjects, very few non-Caucasian subjects. So the outcome was the AI platform makes more mistakes. And what that leads to, for instance, I get stopped by a police officer. We're using an AI tool to determine if I am the suspect they're looking for. And because of increased mistakes, I'm more likely to be arrested than my white counterpart.
So basically, the challenge with AI is it's only as effective as the person who's creating the algorithms that go into the AI. And if the person who's creating the algorithms is biased and isn't aware of it, that's going to go into the software, which is causing the problems.
Exactly. Which is another example. And a lot of people haven't thought about this, and unfortunately, those in the AI world, why diversity is so important.
Mhm.
If your software developers were more diverse,
That's right.
it's less likely that this mistake would have been allowed to occur.
That's
And
right.
not because these people are bad people or
Right?
uh, it's because they don't know what they don't know. And that's
Right.
what unconscious bias is.
Yeah. So, Dr. Chick, what a fascinating conversation. I can't believe how fast the time has gone. If there were three pieces of information that you would want to deliver to the CEO of companies today in terms of AI and DIB, what would those three guideposts be?
Well, the first one, and in all cases,
Mhm.
is to make sure you are as self-aware as possible.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to agree with me or
Mhm,
someone else,
mhm.
but you're aware of why you hold certain thoughts or why you hold certain beliefs.
So the
And
first one
then,
is self-awareness. Mhm.
yeah, and then you can determine if that makes sense for you.
I
So the
want to
first
pause
one
you
is
right there
self-awareness.
before you go to 2 and 3. This is something that I tell leaders all the time. It's great that you want to have a diversity, inclusion, and, whatever you want to call it. That's fantastic. But unless you have personally situated yourself in diversity, inclusion, belonging, unless you're aware of how many opportunities you have to make your own space more diverse and inclusive, like having a colleague that looks like me or looks like you so that you can understand the perspective of a woman of color or a man of color. Unless you in your personal life can understand that, you're going to go into the workplace saying, I value everybody's voice, but you have no one in your personal circle that looks like anybody but you. So I
Mhm.
just want to just kudos and just reinforce your message, leaders. It's got to start in your own personal space so that you can walk into the workplace with some firsthand insight and credibility to say, this is why this is important and understand what your statement means to me or to Dr. Chick. I just had to reinforce that, Dr. Chick. So your
No,
first
no
point
problem.
for CEOs is self-awareness. Your second point would be,
Second point would be understanding the impact you're making.
mm,
Of course, I'm the CEO. I get to tell everybody what to do. And in most cases, people will try to do that.
mhm,
But really, leadership is about influence.
yes.
And influence is not just based on positional power,
Mhm,
it's based on how much I'm trusted,
mhm.
how people think in terms of my competence, what people think about my ability to be empathetic, etc. So that's a big point about leadership. So that's the second one. What impact are you making? And where is your influence coming from? And hopefully, it's not just coming from the fact that you have that president or CEO title next to your name.
As one of my clients likes to say it, the man whose name is on the wall. That's the CEO. But back to your second point about influence, it occurs to me that this is the reason why middle management is so crucial because the C suite has limited interaction with the boots on the ground or the people on the front lines. But middle managers pretty much influence and shape, by and large, the culture. Would you agree with that statement and why it's important the middle management get on board with these types of efforts?
Absolutely. And if you are a CEO or a senior leader of I would say, a middle to large company, you want to think of your middle managers as a bridge between you and the rest of the workforce.
Mhm,
And as you determine what you want in your organization and you are transmitting that across that bridge of middle managers, is the message consistent,
mhm,
understandable?
mhm.
Does it change by the time it gets to the folks, the rest of the organization? So you want to make sure that bridge is sturdy and that bridge doesn't tweak your message in ways that you didn't want it to.
Now let's talk about let's tie those first two together. The personal commitment on the behalf of the CEO and being in a position of influence. The CEO is 100% on board with this. This is their thing because they know it's right for the culture, it's right for their people, it's right for the business. But from a personal standpoint, they have a personal conviction to see this thing through. and then they influence their middle managers. What does the CEO do if you've got some middle managers that just won't get on board for whatever reason? To your point, my name is on the wall. However, here we are. I'm dealing with a potential hesitator. I'm not sure I want to go this direction, or a straight out obstructor. I'm not going in this direction. I'm not going to allow other people around me to go in this direction. How would you advise those CEOs that come across those situations?
There are a variety of tools we can use, and most of them tie back to influence. So,
Mhm.
what are your incentives?
Mhm.
Am I able to ignore some parts of the direction and guidance from the C suite and still get a bonus, still get promoted,
Mhm.
still be taken care of, so to speak, because maybe I'm moving product
Mhm.
or I have a good sales record,
Mhm.
but I'm leaving a trail of dead and injured bodies in
Yep.
my wake.
Mhm.
And of course, I don't care, maybe, but I certainly know that, or I believe I'm doing the right thing because look at my paycheck. Look at
Mhm.
my bonus. Look at this letter that I got from the CEO that said I'm wonderful. I don't think I should change anything.
And that's the challenge. We can't see people's hearts. We don't know what's really in their minds. So let me take it a step further, and then I want you to get to the third point. What if on the leadership team, one of the folks that's an SVP, just because of their own makeup and the way they're built and their thought processes, they just can't get with it. It's not that they're a bad person, it's not that they don't agree with it, but they don't seem to be in lockstep with the rest of the team. What does a leader do when their own direct reports just don't seem to be making the connections?
Well, ultimately, I would argue that person needs to depart the pattern, as pilots
Mm,
would say. Um, and that may seem like, well, that's a bad thing, but we let people go or encourage them to resign in many ways for many different reasons. And there will be cases where certain individuals at various levels of the organization really need to leave the organization because they
You know,
just can't get on board.
your point is a good one because in other cases, we tell people it's not a good culture fit for whatever reason. Let's say we've got
Absolutely.
a manager who's verbally abusive, and we say, we worked with you, we've tried to coach you, but we don't do that here. You have to go. So if a manager is verbally abusive and that doesn't fit the culture, that's a reason to let someone go. If a manager is not adhering to diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and to your point, that does impact innovation, which does impact our bottom line. We've got to help you and encourage you to be successful elsewhere. But why is it when it's because of diversity, inclusion, belonging, people get all up in arms? Oh, this isn't right, blah, 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 blah. They're picking on me. They're messing with my personal belief system versus we're going to have to let you go because you're verbally abusive to our people. Why do we make such a distinction and why do we have a problem with one and not the other?
I think it's because of the importance we place in some cases with DIB.
Mm,
If it's not as important as something else,
mm,
then we're less likely to take action when that
mm,
person, that individual is not achieving at the rate
mm,
we thought they should achieve. It's also, in some cases, more difficult to measure,
mm.
but it's not impossible to measure.
No, it is not. And you and I have spoken about a 360 tool where leaders can measure their inclusive traits as of today, the desired traits that we want them to have as of a month or two from now, and an actual individual development plan to help them get there. So, to your point, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? And
Mhm.
it also goes back to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging needs to be integrated into the business strategy so that it is operationalized and not just
Yes,
talked about for a season. Yeah.
yes.
So, what is the third thing that you would share with leaders? First is personal commitment. Second is influence, and third would be what?
Third would be ability and willingness to change,
Mm,
to be adaptable. I like to use the word versatile. If you're a versatile leader, you're flexible. You seek to understand. You're willing to be empathetic, And one thing about empathy that I like to use when we talk about CEOs, if you're a, and I'll say, if you're a good CEO, you're likely a pretty smart individual. Everybody on your team is not necessarily going to be as smart as you.
Mhm.
So, how do you treat those individuals? That doesn't mean they can't be valued members of your team, but if you aren't willing to be empathetic, you might have thoughts or even say things like, well, that was a dumb idea.
Mm.
So, you want to be innovative, but you just told this person, and let's say it was a dumb idea. I like to use that as a learning moment, not
Mhm.
saying that was a dumb idea, but why do you think that?
Mhm.
Why do you believe this will work?
Mhm.
How can we make that work? So maybe you can take a quote unquote dumb idea and reshape it into something that's beneficial.
Mhm.
Again, that improves empowerment, engagement,
Mhm.
innovation,
Mhm.
because now I know I can try things without being called dumb or
Mhm.
looked at as being dumb,
Mhm.
without being pushed aside because I'm
Mhm.
not smart enough. And
Mhm.
of course, then tomorrow I may have another idea and it may be a great one.
Mhm. Your point about the level of competence as a CEO would be different than the level of competence as an office professional or an engineer or a salesperson. However, that's not to degrade their level of competence because in their realm, in their subject matter expertise, they're the cream of the crop. Otherwise, they wouldn't be on the team. So that's another way to look at diversity, inclusion, and belonging. I have a diverse perspective as the CEO that's valuable. You have a diverse perspective in your role, and you in your role, and you in your role. So that even though we bring different perspectives from different roles, we're equal in that we all need each other to make this thing successful. And so I think that that's just another way to look at diversity. And there's so many ways to look at diversity. It's not always just how we present as an individual. There is the importance of recognizing the diversity in subcultures, the subculture of the C suite and the engineers and the salespeople and the office professionals. And the fact that in their areas of expertise, they're the top of the top of the top. And that's how businesses survive and thrive. Dr. Don, it has
Exactly.
been wonderful having you with me today. I'm able to share with our audience the wonderful, thought provoking conversations that you and I have when we're working with our clients and supporting their goals in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Thank you so much for joining me today. Um, Community, this is one of not only my colleagues, a subject matter expert, tops in his field, but he's also someone that I consider a dear friend and a mentor, Dr. Don Chick. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Don.
And thank you for having me. And you know, I'm passionate about these issues around leadership and company culture and and ability to change. So I'm always happy to discuss it with you and your community. So thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you so much. Community, next week, because we do have 5 Saturdays in September, I have a special treat for you. No tricks, just treats. We're going to be talking with Mr. Bruce Bennett of Ideal 360 Feedback, one of the tools that I referenced earlier in the show today. And that's going to be a fun topic. So be sure to tune in next Saturday. And this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real. In the broadcast. You know what? This can be edited. So let's keep going. Good morning, community. So, like, this never happens. I don't know what's going on today.
And nobody else will ever know it happened because we're going to edit it. You're going to edit it. And it'll
There,
be
my producer is going to edit it. He darn well better edit it. All right, let's try this again.